I am James Holloway, 56 years old, and this is my story, told in one long breath because that is how it still lives inside me, heavy and unbroken. And I never imagined I would be sitting here laying it all out like this. But life has a nasty sense of humor, and it drags you into moments you never trained for. Moments that don't announce themselves with warning signs or second chances. They just arrive and leave a mark. And for me, it all began on a night that still burns in my chest every time I close my eyes. A night dressed up as success and smiles and polished glasses. A night where I stood in a crowded hotel ballroom in Chicago, surrounded by people in sharp suits and fake laughter, smiling like a fool because that is what was expected of me, while my wife's boss put his hand on her like I wasn't even there, right in front of me and everyone else. And I remember thinking, bloody hell, is this really happening, or am I losing my damn mind? Because the brain does strange things when your heart gets punched without warning. And that moment didn't just sting my pride or bruise my ego. It cracked something deep inside me. Something old and solid that I had built over decades of keeping my head down, doing honest work, and believing that respect was still a real thing in this world. And the worst part wasn't even the touch itself, it was the way she didn't move away, the way she laughed like it was normal, like it was harmless, like I was invisible. And that silence around us, that awful silence where nobody said a word, told me everything I needed to know about power and fear and how easily people look the other way when it suits them. And I wish I could say I exploded right there or made a scene or walked out with my head high. But the truth is I stayed. I nodded. I played my role because I am a man who learned a long time ago that reactions give power away, and control is quieter than rage. And that night followed me home, sitting between us in the car, like a third passenger, heavy and unspoken. And when I finally asked her what the hell that was about, she brushed it off with tired excuses about work culture and how things are different now, like respect had an expiration date and I just missed the memo. And that answer hurt more than the touch because it told me she had already justified it in her own mind. And I spent that night on the couch staring at the ceiling, thinking about how I got here, about the 30+ years I spent building a reputation as a straight shooter in construction consulting, a man people trusted with million-dollar decisions because I didn't cut corners or chase attention, about how I believed that if you kept your word and stayed loyal, life would return the favor. And I realized in that quiet darkness that loyalty is often one-sided and respect is something you have to defend. And over the following weeks, I watched patterns form like cracks in glass. Late nights, guarded phone calls, stress she couldn't explain, and I didn't shout or accuse or beg because I wasn't looking for a confession. I was looking for clarity, and clarity arrived in small moments, a message lighting up a screen, a name that showed up too often, a tone that crossed lines without needing dirty words. And that was when something inside me shifted from hurt to focus, because I have spent my life reading fine print, understanding leverage, knowing that the real power in this world doesn't come from volume or threats, but from structure, from rules people forget they agreed to. And what my wife, what her boss never bothered to learn was that I still sat quietly behind several partnerships connected to her company, advisory roles, legacy clauses, protections written years ago to guard against ethical risks and reputational damage. Boring stuff nobody reads until it is too late. And I didn't storm into offices or make demands. I made calm phone calls, asked careful questions, reminded the right people of their own policies, and let their own fear do the rest. Because when money and image are involved, concern spreads faster than truth. And slowly the ground under Victor Crane began to soften. Deals paused, reviews started, funding got delayed. And I watched from a distance as the man who thought he could touch whatever he wanted started to realize that power borrowed from a title disappears the moment trust is questioned. And when he finally called me, voice tight and polite, asking to meet, I knew the shift had happened. And sitting across from him in that quiet restaurant, watching him try intimidation and then charm, I felt no anger, just a strange calm, because the outcome was already written. And when he was removed from his position weeks later under the clean language of mutual separation, I felt no joy, only a heavy sense of closure, because revenge isn't sweet the way movies sell it. It is quiet and lonely, and it costs you things you didn't plan to lose. And in my case, the cost was my marriage, because when everything finally came into the open, when excuses ran out and truths showed their face, I understood that some lines once crossed cannot be uncrossed. And walking away at my age felt like stepping into a cold unknown. But staying would have meant shrinking myself to fit a life without respect. And I wasn't willing to do that, not after everything I had built. And now as I tell this story, not for sympathy or applause, but for honesty, I want people to understand. This strength doesn't always look like shouting or fists or dramatic exits. Sometimes strength is patience, Sometimes it is knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. Sometimes it is letting systems do what they were designed to do. And if there is one thing my life taught me, it is never underestimate the quiet man who knows how things really work. Because when respect is taken from him, he doesn't always fight back with noise. Sometimes he just lets the contracts speak. And when they do, they speak in a language nobody can ignore. Before all this mess turned my life inside out, I was a simple man living a steady life with a complicated career. The kind of life that doesn't make noise but still takes everything you have. And I spent more than 30 years working in commercial construction and consulting, an industry where promises carry weight and your name is either solid or useless. And I learned early on that your word mattered more than your smile, more than flashy talk or big gestures, because when millions are on the line, nobody cares how charming you are if you can't deliver. And I built my reputation slowly, brick by brick, contract by contract, never rushing, never cutting corners, because I believed that doing things the right way would protect me in the long run. And people trusted me not because I was loud or aggressive, but because I didn't play games. I showed up, I listened, and I kept my mouth shut unless I had something real to say. And I came from a generation where you shook a man's hand, looked him straight in the eye, and meant what you said, where respect wasn't a buzzword but a basic expectation. And that same mindset followed me home, into my marriage, into the way I lived my life, because I married Laura when we were both young and hungry for something better. And back then she was full of fire and ambition, smart as hell and driven in ways I admired, because I was never the kind of man who needed to be in the spotlight. And while she climbed the ladder in corporate operations, moving from one title to the next, learning how to survive in rooms full of sharp elbows and sharper smiles, I stayed mostly behind the scenes, advising companies quietly, fixing problems nobody wanted to admit they had, stepping in when deals were about to collapse and making sure they held together without anyone knowing how close they came to falling apart. And over time that balance became our normal, her world loud and visible, mine quiet and controlled. And from the outside we looked solid, the kind of couple people pointed to as proof that hard work pays off. With a good house in a decent neighborhood, kids grown and finding their own way, no public drama, no raised voices spilling out into the street, and people assumed that meant we were happy, that stability automatically meant peace. But what most people never understand is that quiet doesn't always mean healthy. Sometimes it just means nobody is asking the hard questions. Nobody is checking the cracks forming under the surface, and I see now that I was guilty of that too, because I believed that consistency was enough, that loyalty and time would cover the gaps, that as long as I provided and stayed steady, everything else would sort itself out. And I didn't notice how slowly we stopped talking about real things, how our conversations became schedules and updates instead of dreams and fears, how we both got comfortable living side by side instead of truly together. And I tell you this because the man I was before everything broke wasn't weak or careless. He was just a man who believed that doing the right thing quietly would always be enough. And sometimes life waits until you are comfortable, until you think you have it all figured out. And then it reminds you, in the harshest way possible, that stability without honesty is just an illusion waiting to crack. The night everything changed was wrapped in the kind of shine that makes you lower your guard. The kind of evening that tricks you into thinking nothing bad could possibly happen because it was meant to be a celebration. And Laura's company had just landed a massive regional contract that everyone had been chasing for months. So her boss, Victor Crane, decided to host a private event at one of those upscale downtown Chicago hotels where the floors gleam like mirrors and the air smells faintly of money and cologne. And I remember walking in beside my wife feeling quietly proud of her. Not loud pride, but the steady kind that comes from watching someone you've shared a life with achieve something big. And the room itself is burned into my memory in a way that still makes my chest tighten. The soft golden lights hanging low enough to make everyone look a little better than they really are. The expensive suits tailored just right, the dresses chosen carefully to impress, the forced laughter floating through the air like background noise, too loud to be real but too practiced to ignore. And Victor Crane was already holding court the moment we arrived, the kind of man who filled space with his voice alone, loud and confident, talking with his hands, laughing a little too hard at his own jokes, always acting like he owned not just the room but the air everyone was breathing. And I watched him move through the crowd like he was inspecting property, slapping backs, gripping shoulders, pulling people in close as if familiarity itself was a display of power. And something about that already made me uneasy even before anything happened. Because I've spent my life reading people, and Victor was the kind of man who believed success gave him permission. And at first I stayed quiet, nodding to familiar faces, sipping my drink, standing just behind Laura the way I always did at her work events, letting her shine while I observed. And then Victor reached her, and in happened so quickly and yet so slowly that my mind struggled to catch up. His hand slid to her lower back and stayed there a second too long. Not an accident, not a passing touch, but a deliberate pause that made my stomach drop, and Laura laughed, a light laugh that cut deeper than any argument ever could, because it told me she didn't feel the same shock I did. And then Victor leaned in close, too close, his mouth near her ear as he whispered something I couldn't hear. And she didn't pull away, didn't step back, didn't even stiffen, and in that moment time did a strange thing where everything around me blurred and sharpened at the same time, and I remember thinking, bloody hell, is this really happening or am I losing my mind? Because your brain looks for any explanation that doesn't involve pain, and before I could even process that, his hand moved again, touching her arm, then her waist, casual and confident, right there in front of me, in front of everyone, like I was just another piece of furniture in the room, and I stood there frozen, my face locked in a polite smile that felt like it was cracking, my heart pounding so hard I thought people around me must hear it. And I waited for someone, anyone, to react, to clear their throat, to look uncomfortable, to acknowledge that a line had just been crossed. But nobody said a word, nobody shifted, nobody stepped in, and that silence was louder than any insult I had ever heard in my life, because it told me that this wasn't just about Victor and Laura. It was about a whole room full of people who had decided that power mattered more than respect. And as I stood there, holding my drink with a grip so tight my knuckles went white, memories rushed through my head, decades of believing in professionalism, in boundaries, in the idea that marriage meant something even in public spaces, and I felt a strange mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief wash over me. Because it wasn't just that my wife's boss touched her, it was that he did it without fear, without hesitation, as if he knew nobody would challenge him. And I realized in that moment that I wasn't just watching a personal betrayal. I was witnessing how power really works when nobody checks it, and Laura finally stepped slightly away. Not enough to make a point, but just enough to continue the conversation, and Victor moved on, already scanning the room for his next audience, leaving me standing there with a smile plastered on my face and something broken forming quietly inside my chest, and I wanted to say something, to pull her aside, to make my presence known. But years of discipline and self-control kicked in, because scenes only ever help the person who caused them. And I told myself I would handle this later, privately, with dignity. Even as my hands trembled and my throat felt tight, and the rest of the night passed in a haze, conversations washing over me without meaning, congratulations that felt hollow, clinking glasses that sounded like mockery, and every time I looked at Laura, I wondered how we had arrived at a moment where I could feel so invisible standing right beside her. And when we finally left that hotel, stepping out into the cool night air, the city lights reflecting off the pavement, I knew with absolute certainty that something fundamental had shifted, because no matter how much time passed, no matter how many explanations followed, that image of her laughing while another man touched her in front of me would never leave my mind. And that night, meant to celebrate success, became the moment my old life quietly ended, even though I didn't yet know what would rise in its place. The drive home was the quietest ride we had shared in years, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful but sharp, cutting into you with every mile. And I remember the moment the car doors closed, it felt like the world outside disappeared, like we were sealed inside a box filled with everything neither of us wanted to say. No music playing, no small talk to smooth the edges, just the hum of the engine and the distant sound of the city breathing around us. And the lights of downtown Chicago blurred past the windows in long streaks of white and red, and I felt detached from my own body, like I was watching my life from somewhere above the windshield, seeing two people sitting side by side who no longer knew how to reach each other. And my hands stayed steady on the steering wheel even though my chest felt tight, because discipline is a hard habit to break when you've lived by it for decades. And minutes passed like hours before I finally spoke, my voice calm but strained, asking her what that was about, asking her to explain what I had just witnessed with my own eyes. And she sighed, that long tired sigh people use when they think they're being unfairly questioned. And she said I was overthinking it, that Victor was just being friendly, just celebrating, just enjoying the moment. And that word friendly landed on me like a slap to the face, because there are words you accept and words that insult your intelligence, and friendly was the latter. And I told her it crossed a line, that I wouldn't have done that to another man's wife, that respect doesn't change just because you wear a suit and stand in a fancy room. And she snapped back with a tone I barely recognized, saying I didn't understand corporate culture anymore, that things were different now, that I was old-fashioned and out of touch. And hearing that hurt in a way I hadn't prepared for, because it wasn't just a defense of her boss, it was a dismissal of me, of the values I had lived by, the values that built the very life she was enjoying. And the argument didn't explode the way movie scenes do. It fizzled into something worse. A cold distance where both of us stared forward as if the road ahead mattered more than the truth sitting between us. And when we pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always had. Lights off, quiet, familiar. And yet it felt like stepping into a place that no longer belonged to me. And inside we moved around each other carefully, brushing past without touching, and I told her I was sleeping on the couch. Not as a punishment or a dramatic statement, but because I needed space to breathe. And that night stretched on forever, me lying there staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly above me. The room lit faintly by the streetlight outside, replaying that moment in the ballroom over and over, the laugh, the hand, the silence. And the more I replayed it, the clearer things became, because this wasn't just about jealousy or insecurity or age. It was about boundaries and power and the way Victor Crane carried himself like a man who had never been told no. And I realized then that what bothered me most wasn't even what he did. It was how confident he was doing it. How comfortable he seemed crossing lines because he believed there would be no consequences. And that thought settled into me like a stone, heavy and unavoidable, because I've spent my entire career watching men like him rise quickly and fall quietly. Men who mistake position for invincibility. And as the hours passed and sleep refused to come, I understood something important that changed the way I saw everything that followed. This wasn't just about my wife or my marriage or my hurt pride. This was about power, about how it is used and abused when nobody pushes back. And Victor Crane loved power more than anything, more than respect, more than decency, more than the people around him. And lying there in the dark, listening to the house settle and the night move on without me, I made a decision I didn't yet fully understand. A decision not to react like a wounded husband, but to respond like a man who knows how systems work. Because if Victor thought he could take whatever he wanted without consequence, he had underestimated the quiet man watching from the corner. And that realization didn't bring me peace, but it brought me clarity. And sometimes clarity is the first step toward a reckoning nobody sees coming. The truth never arrives all at once. It seeps in slowly, quietly, the way water finds cracks in a wall you thought was solid. And over the next few weeks after that night, I found myself paying attention in a way I never had before. Not because I wanted to spy or control, but because something inside me refused to stay asleep any longer. And Laura started working late more often. Not the occasional late night that comes with ambition, but a steady pattern that shifted the rhythm of our home. Dinners going cold, conversation shortened the tired phrases, her mind always somewhere else even when her body was sitting across from me. And I noticed how she began taking calls in other rooms, lowering her voice, closing doors that used to stay open. And at first I told myself it was stress, that big contracts come with big pressure, that I was reading too much into things because I was hurt. But denial only works for so long before reality pushes back. And then there was the phone, always close, always face down, always guarded like it held state secrets instead of simple messages. And I didn't yell or demand answers or accuse her of anything, because I've learned that noise only scares truth deeper into hiding. And instead I listened, I watched, I remembered. Because when you've spent your life reading contracts, you learn that what matters most is never the loud statement, but the fine print, the patterns, the repeated behaviors that tell the real story. And people are no different. They always leave patterns even when they think they're being careful. And I started connecting dots I wish I never had to see. The way her mood shifted after certain calls. The tension that followed her into the room like a shadow. The way she avoided my eyes when Victor's name came up casually in conversation. And still I said nothing, because part of me hoped I was wrong. Hoped that time would smooth this over and make me feel foolish for doubting the woman I had shared decades with. But hope has a way of dying quietly when facts keep piling up. And then came the night that changed everything again. Not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a small, ordinary moment that carried more weight than any argument ever could. Laura had fallen asleep before me, exhaustion finally pulling her under, and the house was still, the kind of stillness that makes you aware of every sound, every tick of the clock. And her phone was resting on the nightstand between us, something she rarely allowed anymore. And then it buzzed just once, a soft vibration that felt loud in the silence, and the screen lit up, casting a faint glow across the room. And I didn't pick it up, I didn't touch it, I didn't need to, because the message preview was right there, clear enough to read without crossing any lines. And it was from Victor, and it wasn't graphic or explicit or scandalous in the way people imagine betrayal looking, but it was familiar in a way that made my chest tighten, the kind of tone that assumes access, that carries comfort and expectation. the kind of message that doesn't belong between a boss and an employee late at night. And as I stared at those words, my heart didn't race or explode. It sank heavy and cold, because in that moment doubt finally gave way to certainty. And certainty is a strange thing. It hurts less than suspicion because at least it tells you where you stand. And lying there in the dark with that screen fading back to black, I felt something shift inside me, something hard and calm settling into place. And that was the moment I stopped being just a hurt husband replaying a painful scene and became a man with a plan. Because I understood then that begging for respect only teaches people how little they have to give you. And I wasn't going to do that. Not at this stage of my life, not after everything I had built. And I realized that Victor Crane wasn't just careless or charming or inappropriate. He was intentional. And people like him don't stop unless they are forced to. And the truth was no longer just about my marriage. It was about how power was being used behind closed doors, how lines were crossed quietly while everyone pretended not to notice. And I knew something else too, something that brought a cold clarity to my thoughts. I knew the world Victor lived in. I knew how those companies worked, how deals were structured, how reputations were protected on paper and destroyed in silence. And I knew that, while he thought he was untouchable, he had signed his name to rules he never expected to apply to him. And as I lay there listening to Laura breathe, feeling the weight of years pressing down on my chest, I made a promise to myself that I would not explode or expose or humiliate anyone out of anger, because anger fades and leaves you empty, but strategy lasts, and I wasn't going to ask for respect anymore. I was going to take it back the only way I knew how, quietly, carefully, and with consequences that would speak louder than any words I could ever say. Here's the thing most people never knew about me, and it's something I learned early in my career to keep to myself. Even though I had stepped back from full-time consulting years ago and no longer showed up to offices every morning or sat at long tables arguing over projections, I never really left the world of deals and decisions, because when you spend decades earning trust the right way, people don't stop calling just because you slow down. And I still held quiet advisory roles with several firms that partnered directly with Laura's company, big firms with serious money on the line, the kind that moved millions with a single signature and protected themselves with documents thick enough to stop a door. And those roles weren't flashy or public. They were the kind where you're brought in when something feels off, when leadership wants a second set of eyes that won't sugarcoat the truth. And Victor Crane had no idea I was still connected like that, no idea that years earlier I had personally helped draft and review joint agreements that were now sitting quietly in filing systems and digital vaults, agreements designed to protect companies from exactly the kind of behavior he treated like a privilege, clauses buried deep under legal language about misconduct, conflicts of interest and reputational risk, clauses written not for drama but for moments when leadership behavior threatened a company's image or financial stability. And those clauses were clear, ruthless even, allowing immediate termination, frozen funding, or withdrawal if ethical concerns surfaced. And the funny thing about contracts is that everyone rushes to the signature page and skips the boring parts because nobody believes those sections will ever apply to them, especially not men like Victor who walk through rooms like rules are for other people. And I didn't storm in waving papers or threatening exposure, because that's not how leverage works. Leverage works best when the other side doesn't realize it's already been applied, and so I started making calls, casual ones, the kind where your voice stays calm and almost bored, the kind where you sound concerned rather than angry, because anger makes people defensive and concern makes them listen. And I asked questions that didn't accuse anyone of anything but invited them to think. I asked how things were going with leadership alignment, whether internal conduct policies were being reviewed after the recent growth, whether anyone had considered reputational safeguards given the visibility of the new contract. And those questions landed exactly where I expected them to, because people in that world are trained to hear what isn't being said. And I could almost feel the shift through the phone lines, the slight pauses, the careful responses, the mental notes being taken on the other end. And I planted seeds without ever using Victor's name, seeds that grew quietly in the dark as emails were forwarded. Meetings were scheduled, and legal teams were asked to reread sections of agreements they hadn't looked at in years. And I didn't lie or exaggerate or make claims I couldn't support. I simply reminded people of the rules they had already agreed to play by. And that's the beauty of letting paperwork do the talking, because paper doesn't raise its voice and it doesn't lose its temper. It just sits there waiting. And as days turned into weeks, I watched the ripple effects begin. Partners asking for clarification, funding timelines suddenly slowing down, internal reviews being mentioned more often in conversations Laura didn't realize I could overhear. And through all of this I stayed exactly where I was, quiet, patient, saying very little. Because once you set something in motion at that level, you don't chase it, you let it move on its own. And what Victor never understood was that power built on charm and fear collapses the moment accountability enters the room. Because contracts don't care how loud you are or how important you think you are. They only care about what you signed. And as the pressure mounted, I could see the strain in Laura too. The stress she brought home without explanation, the tension that followed her from room to room, and part of me felt the weight of that because this wasn't a game and it wasn't painless. But another part of me knew that this was the only language men like Victor truly respect. Not confrontation, not morality, but consequences written in black and white. And I realized something else during that time, something that settled my resolve even deeper. Victor didn't just disrespect me that night in the ballroom. He disrespected the systems that protected everyone under him. The employees who trusted leadership to behave with some level of decency, the partners who trusted that their reputations wouldn't be dragged into unnecessary risk. And that made what I was doing feel less like revenge and more like correction, because when people like him are allowed to move unchecked, the damage spreads far beyond one marriage or one moment. And I tell you this because it's important to understand that the most effective responses are often invisible. They don't come with speeches or ultimatums. They come with reminders, quiet reminders of obligations and standards and consequences that never went away just because someone stopped paying attention. And as I sat back and watched the process unfold, I knew Victor Crane was walking toward a wall he didn't see, built not by my anger but by his own signatures. And there is a strange calm that comes from knowing you didn't break any rules to defend yourself. You simply remembered them better than the man who thought he was above them. The fall never announces itself with a crash. It starts with a shift in balance so small that only the people standing on solid ground can feel it. And that is why it didn't happen overnight, because real revenge, real consequences never move fast. They move with patience and precision. And the first sign was subtle, almost polite, when one major partner quietly pulled back, citing an internal review that needed to be completed before moving forward. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory, just enough hesitation to make people uncomfortable. And then another firm delayed funding, asking for clarification on leadership ethics and governance standards in light of recent expansion. Words chosen carefully, professionally, but loaded with meaning for anyone who understood how these worlds operate. And suddenly the momentum Victor Crane had been riding so confidently began to slow, like a powerful engine losing fuel without warning. And I could almost picture him in those executive meetings, leaning forward, smiling a little too hard, trying to reassure rooms full of people who were now asking questions instead of nodding along. And that's when the tension started to bleed into our home. Laura came back from work later than usual with stress written all over her face, snapping at small things, sighing heavily, pacing the kitchen like she was carrying a weight she couldn't put down. And I watched quietly as her phone rang more often, as her emails demanded urgent attention late into the night. And one evening she finally asked me if I knew what was going on. Her voice sharp but uncertain. And I looked her straight in the eye and said no. And that wasn't a lie, not in the way lies usually work, because I hadn't done anything illegal or dishonest. I hadn't accused anyone or spread rumors. I had simply reminded people of the rules Victor himself had agreed to follow. And the truth has a way of working on its own once it's given room. And as the days passed, the pressure around Victor tightened, meetings grew tense, decisions stalled. His name stopped being spoken with admiration and started being spoken with caution. And for a man like him, caution feels like disrespect. And I could see the panic beginning to surface through secondhand stories and subtle changes. The way Laura mentioned that leadership was on edge. The way she complained about uncertainty at work without ever saying his name directly. And through all of it, I stayed calm, steady, unchanged, because there is something deeply unsettling to powerful people about facing consequences they can't argue their way out of. And bloody hell, watching him unravel without raising my voice or making a single demand was the strangest satisfaction I had ever felt. Not the loud satisfaction of victory, but the quiet confirmation that patience still matters, that systems still work when you understand them, and that men who build their strength on unchecked authority always crumble the moment accountability enters the room. And even though I knew the cost of what was unfolding, even though I could feel the strain it was putting on my marriage and my home, I also knew there was no turning back, because once the fall begins, it follows its own gravity. And Victor Crane was finally learning what it feels like to stand on the other side of power, where silence replaces praise and every step forward feels uncertain. And I understood then that the most effective justice doesn't need witnesses or applause. It just needs time, and time was no longer on his side. Eventually the moment arrived that I knew had been circling us both like a quiet storm, because men like Victor Crane don't stay in the dark forever. They feel the shift even if they don't understand it. And one afternoon my phone rang with his name on the screen. His voice controlled but tight, polite in a way that told me suspicion had finally caught up to him. And he asked if we could meet, just to talk, man to man, and I agreed without hesitation because I had nothing to hide and nothing to fear, and we chose a quiet restaurant not far from the river, the kind of place where conversations stay private and nobody pays much attention to the table in the corner. And when I walked in, he was already there, sitting stiffly with his jacket still on, eyes scanning the room like he was expecting trouble to walk in behind me. And as I took my seat across from him, I noticed how different he looked from the man who had filled that ballroom weeks earlier. The confidence still there but cracked, around the edges like a mask worn too long. And at first he tried intimidation, leaning forward slightly, lowering his voice, talking about misunderstandings and consequences and how dangerous rumors can be in corporate environments. And I listened calmly, nodding once or twice, letting him spend his energy because I knew men like him need to hear themselves speak before they realize they're losing control. And when that didn't rattle me, he shifted gears, tried charm instead, laughed lightly, said we were both professionals, both experienced, that surely we could understand how things get blown out of proportion. And I let that hang in the air for a moment before I finally spoke, not raising my voice, not leaning in, just stating something simple and undeniable, that touching another man's wife in public is a bad look for a leader, no matter how powerful he thinks he is, and the effect was immediate and almost shocking. His face drained of color as if someone had flipped a switch, because in that moment he realized two things at once. First, that I knew exactly what he had done, and second, that I wasn't asking him to explain it away. And the silence that followed was heavy, thicker than anything we had shared before, and he opened his mouth to respond but nothing came out, because the truth doesn't leave much room for defense when it's delivered calmly. And I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the realization that power isn't just about money or titles, or how many people laugh at your jokes. It's about leverage, about understanding where the real pressure points are. And he finally asked me almost quietly what I wanted, and I told him I didn't want anything, that this wasn't a negotiation, that I had simply reminded people of standards that already existed. And if that caused problems for him, then maybe he should think about why. And that was when he truly understood how late he was to the game, because leverage doesn't announce itself and it doesn't ask permission, it just sits there waiting for the right moment. And when we stood to leave, there was no handshake, no threats, no dramatic words exchanged, just two men walking out of the same restaurant knowing only one of them still had solid ground under his feet. And over the next month the process finished what it had started. Quietly and efficiently, Victor Crane was removed from his position under clean corporate language, officially labeled a mutual decision, a strategic transition, the kind of phrasing designed to protect appearances. But unofficially everyone knew exactly what had happened, because respect lost at the top echoes all the way down. And as news filtered through back channels and whispered conversations, I felt no triumph, only a deep, steady sense of finality. Because the confrontation wasn't about winning or humiliating him. It was about balance being restored, about a man learning too late that power borrowed from silence collapses the moment someone decides not to stay quiet. And as I walked away from that chapter of my life, I understood something I had always known but never needed to test until then. That the strongest position you can ever sit in is the one where you don't need to threaten, don't need to beg, and don't need to raise your voice. Because when the truth and the leverage are on your side, the outcome is already written. Revenge always has a price, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never lived through the quiet aftermath when the noise dies down and you're left alone with what you've won and what you've lost. And for me, the cost came not in headlines or public fallout, but in the slow, painful unraveling of a marriage I once believed would carry me through the rest of my life. Because Laura and I didn't survive this the way I once hoped we might, not with apologies and rebuilding and some dramatic return to normal, but with an honesty that cut deeper than anger ever could. And when the truth finally spilled out, it wasn't in a screaming match or a confession under pressure. It came one evening when we were both too tired to pretend anymore, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table with the house quiet around us. And she admitted something that settled into my chest like a final weight. She said she enjoyed the attention, not just from Victor but from what he represented, the power, the validation, the feeling of being seen and desired in rooms where everything was a competition. And hearing that didn't make me angry the way I expected. It made something inside me shut down completely, because it told me that the problem wasn't a moment or a mistake or even a man. It was a distance that had grown between us so gradually neither of us had fully acknowledged it until it was too wide to cross. And I realized then that no amount of patience or understanding could undo the fact that she had crossed a line and then justified it to herself. And we separated not long after, quietly and without drama, dividing a life built over decades into boxes and schedules and practical conversations that felt serene in their calmness. And it hurt, mate, in a deep and steady way that didn't come with tears every day but sat with me like a dull ache. Because you don't just lose a partner when a marriage ends, you lose shared history, shared habits, the person who knew your routines and your silences. And there were nights when the house felt too big and too quiet, when I questioned whether any of it had been worth it, whether holding my ground had cost me something I could never replace. But with time came a clarity I hadn't expected, because I learned that respect isn't something you negotiate after 50. It isn't a conversation you have once lines have already been crossed. It's something that exists or it doesn't, and trying to bargain for it only teaches people how much of yourself you're willing to give away to keep the peace. And I understood that if I had stayed, if I had swallowed that truth and tried to move forward without real accountability, I would have slowly disappeared inside my own life, shrinking to fit a version of marriage where my values were treated like an inconvenience. And losing my marriage hurt more than I can fully explain, but losing myself would have been worse, because at this stage of life there are fewer years ahead than behind, and I wasn't willing to spend them doubting my own worth or questioning my own instincts. And as painful as it was to walk away from something that once meant everything to me, it also brought a strange sense of peace, because for the first time in a long time I was no longer compromising my core just to keep something intact. And I came to understand that some endings are not failures but corrections, hard ones, expensive ones, but necessary, and the price I paid taught me a lesson I will carry for the rest of my life, that self-respect is the one thing you cannot afford to lose, no matter how much it costs you to protect it. I'm not proud of every emotion that ran through me during that turbulent period of my life. Every flash of anger, every pang of betrayal, every restless night where I questioned everything I had built and everything I thought I knew about loyalty and love. But I am proud of how I navigated it, proud of the restraint I showed when my instincts screamed for confrontation, for dramatics, for a public scene that would have left scars and whispers behind me. Because I understood in that moment that the real power lies not in noise, not in the theatrics of emotion, but in the control of your mind and the steady application of your principles. And I never screamed, never begged, never allowed myself to descend into the kind of desperation that makes people lose sight of their own worth. And I certainly didn't destroy myself trying to destroy someone else, because vengeance that consumes you is no victory at all. It is simply another form of defeat, a hollow echo of what might have been. And instead I relied on what I had earned over a lifetime, the slow accumulation of knowledge, the quiet mastery of patience, the principles I had lived by for more than 5 decades, the kind of wisdom that comes not from books or speeches but from living through hard negotiations, late nights balancing contracts, watching power shift in offices and boardrooms, learning how people bend when the right leverage is applied. And the more I applied these lessons in real time, the more I realized that respect, once broken, is not something you reclaim with anger or threats. It is something you restore with clarity, strategy, and the patient insistence on truth. And the lesson I leave here, if there is one that matters, is never underestimate the quiet man of the room, the one who observes, calculates, and waits, because that man sees what others do not, hears what others cannot, and moves with a precision that surprises those who believe only volume and bravado can sway outcomes. And in my case, the quiet man used contracts, advisories, and the leverage of experience to correct what had been violated, to ensure accountability in a world where loud voices often mask recklessness. And through this, I learned something else. The strongest forms of revenge, the ones that leave real impact and change, are rarely loud, rarely spectacular in the way people imagine. They are subtle, methodical, and written in a language the offender cannot ignore. Ink on paper, clauses, and agreements, carefully constructed, enforced by truth and principle, not by anger. And when those tools are wielded correctly, they ripple outward, touching decisions, reputations, and the very structure that once seemed untouchable. And watching that unfold, seeing consequences arrive not because I screamed or demanded them but because the systems themselves carried my intention, brought a satisfaction that is far different from the fleeting thrill of drama. A satisfaction rooted in justice, in order, restored, in the calm certainty that integrity will always outlast arrogance. And reflecting on all of it now, years later, I understand that life will often test your patience, your ethics, your ability to act without surrendering your soul to anger. And what separates those who merely survive from those who emerge stronger is the choice to respond deliberately, to hold fast to principles even when everything inside screams for immediate action. And that is why I can say with certainty that losing my marriage, enduring betrayal, and watching someone misuse their power was among the hardest experiences of my life. But it also became one of the most instructive, because it forced me to rely on what mattered most: my mind, my patience, and the knowledge that true strength is quiet, deliberate, and ultimately irreversible when applied with care. And if there is any advice I can offer to anyone listening or reading this, it is this: respect is fragile, and once broken, it can be restored in ways that are quiet but absolute, ways that change the course of events without the need for shouting, without the need for spectacle. And sometimes the most powerful actions are invisible to the casual observer, taking place in boardrooms, in contracts, in quiet calls, in decisions made with precision rather than emotion. And those who underestimate this often find themselves surprised by outcomes they believe they controlled. And that is the essence of what I want to leave you with: the quiet man, the patient mind, the deliberate principle. These are the instruments of true influence, the tools that can correct imbalance, enforce accountability, and restore what has been violated without ever sacrificing the integrity of your own life. And understanding this has changed the way I approach everything, because I have seen firsthand how calm observation, careful planning, and reliance on truth can move mountains in ways that loud gestures never will. And while I am not proud of every sleepless night, every ache of betrayal, every moment of doubt that filled those long weeks, I am proud of the way I stayed composed, of the way I allowed systems, contracts, and careful leverage to carry the consequences rather than my own temper. Because doing so preserved me, preserved my values, and ultimately preserved the very part of myself that cannot be reclaimed once it is lost. And that is the final lesson I leave here, clear and unshakable. Never underestimate the quiet man, never undervalue the patience born of experience, and never forget that respect, once broken, can be answered in ways that change everything, not with noise or fury, but with intelligence, principle, and the unstoppable force of truth applied in the right way, at the right time, and with the certainty that those who violate boundaries will meet consequences they cannot ignore. Because in the end, life rewards not the loudest, not the flashiest, but the steady, deliberate, principled, and patient, the quiet men who understand the weight of what they hold and the impact of every action taken with care. And if there is one memory I want to leave with anyone who hears this story, it is that power unchecked is dangerous, but power balanced with principle is unstoppable. And sometimes the loudest justice is written in silence, ink, and truth, and those who fail to see it coming are the ones who suffer quietly, learning too late that the quiet man in the room has already moved. And nothing in the world, no charm, no arrogance, no title, can undo the weight of decisions made with patience, clarity, and a lifetime of earned wisdom. And that, in essence, is the legacy of what I faced, what I endured, and what I ultimately learned. That the strongest, most effective, and most lasting responses in life come not from anger, not from shouting, not from trying to fight chaos with more chaos, but from quiet observation, careful leverage, unwavering principles, and the courage to allow truth to speak for itself. And in allowing that, you not only protect yourself, you restore balance, you enforce accountability, and you demonstrate that even in the most personal and painful betrayals, strength does not come from noise. It comes from the calm, deliberate application of wisdom earned over decades. The kind of wisdom that transforms hardship into clarity, betrayal into strategy, and hurt into a foundation upon which you rebuild not just your life, but your own understanding of what it means to command respect without ever demanding it. And as I sit back now, telling this story, reflecting on what was lost, what was gained, and what I had to discover about myself in the process, I realize that this lesson is timeless, and it applies far beyond my own experience. Those who are patient, deliberate, principled, and quiet in their strength will always wield power in ways that echo long after the moment passes. Because the world may reward the loud, the brazen, and the reckless, but it respects and ultimately answers to the quiet man who knows exactly how to act when the stakes are highest. And that is the final truth I leave behind.